The story takes place at Faber College in 1962, and it seems to be a prestigious academy. Kent and Larry make it to the fraternity house, and they meet Doug at the door. Doug takes them back to the common room to meet some of the other brothers, along with some reject pledges. Kent manages to wander over to Greg, who introduces him to everyone else until he winds up back in the same corner. By the end of the night, Kent and Larry think that Omega might not be for them, but Kent assures Larry that they can get into the Delta house, since his brother went there before him. When they reach the Delta house, there is a clear difference in style and presentation, and they meet Bluto before making their way in. This fraternity runs more like a saloon, and Larry and Kent make themselves right at home. Larry heads downstairs to grab a beer, and eventually, Kent meets Eric and Boone before Boone runs off to try and smooth things over with his girlfriend, Katie. Katie doesn't like the fact that he can't take life seriously, and he doesn't show any signs of changing. The next day, Dean Vernon talks with Greg from Omega House, and he gives plenty of reasons as to why Delta is the absolute worst fraternity house. Dean plans to kick the members of Delta out this year, and he asks Greg to find a reason to revoke Delta's charter. Meanwhile, Delta House sits down to go over their pledges, and no one seems to want Kent as part of Delta. It comes down to Eric defending Kent before he's accepted as a new pledge. That night, Delta House celebrates the new pledges, while Omega House accepts its pledges in a much different fashion. The next day at class, Professor Jennings gives a lecture on classic literature, and everyone seems to be handling class in their own ways, whether it's sleeping, drawing, or listening. Later at the track, Bluto spies up the cheerleader's skirt, and the other boys go to their own clubs. Eric and Boone decide to have some fun and mess with Doug while he messes with Kent in ROTC formation. After classes, Boone tells Katie that Larry needs a girl, and they go to meet up with Professor Jennings at his house. Eventually, Professor Jennings offers them a joint, and he sits down to smoke it with them. Professor of the Year, everyone! That evening, Kent reports for stable duty, and the horse isn't happy to have him around. Suddenly, Doug shows up and calms the horse down by mouth-feeding it. Doug tells Kent that his time here is limited, but what he doesn't know is that more members of Delta House are sneaking in. After Doug leaves, they tell Kent their plan for revenge. They take Doug's horse and stick it in the dean's office. D-Day gives Kent a weapon to use in the office, and Bluto asks him if it's just blanks in it. D-Day assures him they are. But when they hear the horse collapse after Kent shoots, they rush inside to find that it actually had a heart attack. The next day, the mayor arrives in the dean's office to tell him that he needs money from the college if they plan to use any facilities around town. On top of that, he wants Delta House to be eliminated. Later, everyone goes to the cafeteria. Here, Bluto terrorizes some of Omega House before running mad out of the cafeteria. That night, Mandy and Greg go to a makeout point to watch the stars, but nothing she's doing seems to work for him, since he's so preoccupied with Delta House issues. When nothing works, she takes her gloves off and asks him to take her back. Bluto watches them kiss goodnight, and then he sneaks up to watch the girls have a pillow fight. When he realizes that this isn't Mandy's room, he hops on over to the next window. He ends up liking what he sees too much, and he topples over on the ladder. The next day, Chip sneaks into the main office to swap out the labels for the psychology midterm. And that night, D-Day goes dumpster diving with Bluto to look for the cheat sheet. They use these wrong answers on the test, and the dean pays Delta House a visit later after the tests are graded. Dean tells the guys that if they have one more strike, they are absolutely finished. Boone and Eric come up with a grand idea to have a toga party anyway, and the rest of the house is for it. Later, Boone asks Katie if she'll come to the party, but she thinks that he should focus on his future instead. When the guys get to the house, they find that Kent is borrowing his brother's fancy car, and they have him take them to the grocery store, where they steal meat and hit on Dean's wife. Before Larry walks out, the cashier, Clarette, assures him that he's fine to leave, and he invites her to the toga party as his date. She agrees, and that night, the toga party goes off seemingly well. Just as everyone is dancing on the dance floor, Mrs. Wormer crashes the party already drunk, and she heads inside to enjoy the party. Meanwhile, Larry and Clorette head upstairs while the rest of the party starts to wind down. Eric takes Mrs. Wormer up to his room, and he sets the mood just right. Just as things get started with Clorette, she ends up passing out drunk, and Larry has a moral civil war on whether he should take her or not. In the end, he decides to take her home in a shopping cart. He doorbell ditches her on the front porch, and Clorette's dad finds his daughter there. He ends up calling the dean to blame him, and Dean seems to know that Delta House is to blame. The next day, it's announced that Delta House will have their trial, and everyone gathers for the big moment. Greg starts the proceedings for Delta House's court, and Hoover tries to defend Delta House. Eventually, Eric has to get in front of the court to try and defend the house, since the dean is making sure that this is the most unfair trial. Eric manages to spin his words so well that the entire Delta House walks out of the courtroom, but the dean tells them that their charter is definitely revoked. When they get back to their house, they find movers there emptying the entire house, and some of them decide to go on a little road trip with Kent's family car. Boone, Eric, Larry, and Kent head out for a night at a neighboring college, and Eric assures them that they have dates waiting. Once there, Eric heads inside to pick up Fawn. After waiting for a moment, Fawn's roommate, Shelley, comes down, and she tells him that Fawn is dead. Eric thinks that it's a joke at first, but Shelley shows him the newspaper clipping. Eric appears distraught, and Shelley tells him that she'll do anything to make him feel better. He tells her that he shouldn't be alone tonight, and he asks her out. Shelley wastes no time in going to get her coat, and Eric asks her to get 3 friends for the guys. They end up ramming another car when they pull into the dance hall, and once inside, they really feel out of place. Eventually, Eric sulks back to the car to keep playing his bit, and Shelley follows him to the back seat of the car. Back inside, some of the local men ask to dance with the guys' dates, and all of the guys bail. When they get to the car, Shelley jumps into the next car over, and the guys crash the family car into everything as they escape. In the morning, the guys are still in the car, and they eat their breakfast. Back at school, Omega House is preparing for the homecoming parade, and Babs tells Greg that Mandy is messing around with Eric behind his back. At what used to be Delta House, the guys get back with what's left of the car, and Boone heads out to find Katie. D-Day assures Kent that the car will look good as new once he's done, and Eric tries to tell Kent his scheme to get his family a new car from the insurance company. Meanwhile, Boone gets to Katie's house, and he starts telling her that he missed her. Suddenly, he hears Professor Jennings in her bedroom, and he rushes out of the house. Back at the house, Babs calls Eric and tells him to meet Mandy at a hotel later. When Eric gets to the hotel, he gets jumped by Greg and his house brothers. And back at school, the dean goes over Delta House's GPAs. They are so low that the entirety of Delta House has been expelled, but at least Kent gets the throw up on the dean before leaving. That night, Greg goes to makeout point with Mandy, and he seems to still be having trouble getting it on. Back at Delta House, the guys sit around and wonder what they're going to do next. Just then, Eric is helped in, and he tells the guys what happened. Bluto tries to rally Delta House, and eventually, Eric starts to agree with them. Finally, the whole crew rallies with them. Later, Larry heads to Clorette's house, and he does his best to get her attention. He ends up breaking her window before she finally comes down. The two of them head to the football field, and Larry admits that he's never done this before. To top it off, Clorette admits that she's only 13, and that's the end of that. The next day, Delta House posts up all over the parade, and Katie runs into Hoover. She tries to ask where Boone is, but Hoover really tries to convince her that she won't want to be in the area in a little bit. The mayor and dean make it to the center of town, and they start the parade. The rest of Delta checks their watch to make sure that it's time for their move, and they start driving their float into downtown. Stork takes over the marching band and sends them down an alleyway to a dead end. Hoover ties a chain to the Omega float, and it even brings down a telephone pole. Just then, the Delta float runs another float off the street. Kent tosses 1,000 marbles in the way of ROTC, and they are now useless in helping. Delta House manages to start a full-blown panic. Floats are destroyed, women are flying in bedrooms, and utter chaos fills the streets. Next, we see Eric put Doug in his place in one punch. The boys' plan of completely ruining the event was a total success. In the end, this was one of the biggest college mischief films of the time, and it inspired countless films that followed in its footsteps. And that wraps up this recap. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this recap, please subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.